Redeem Zoomer. I'm going to call you Richard for this podcast, but Redeem Zoomer, thank you so much for joining me. I don't know where to start with you because I am both encouraged that you took one of my videos and you very rarely react to things. And so that was, I should feel honored in a sense, but also at the same time, you kind of roasted me. And so I don't know if I should be offended or if I should be encouraged that Redeem Zoomer would.
Don't worry. No, I was not trying to roast you. I'm sorry if it came across that way. I was just trying to roast your religion. That's all it was. No, So yeah, I did make a response video to you when you said, is Protestantism dying? And really, I was just trying to do, I guess you could say, damage control because your video basically said a lot of people are leaving evangelical churches, or maybe not leaving, but a lot of people who are getting interested in Christianity are repelled by these evangelical churches with a concert and a TED talk. And to label them, you just sort of said Protestant. And that's what a lot of Catholic and Orthodox people do. So my big obsession lately has not been to try and defend Protestantism and try and say, here's why you should be Protestant instead of Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. My main crusade has been trying to get people to define Protestant rightly. So I agree with the Catholics and Orthodox that these rock concert mega churches are not traditional Christianity, not a church that I would recommend to anyone. But I don't think that's Protestantism, because I don't think we can define Protestantism as just this miscellaneous category of any church that any Joe Schmo starts that's not Catholic or Orthodox. Yeah. I define Protestant as churches that come from the Reformation. Billy Bob's megachurch, that doesn't come from the Reformation. Your local Presbyterian church, yes. Lutheran church, yes. Episcopal church, yes. United Methodist Church, Congregationalist church, even some historic American Baptist churches can trace their roots back to the Reformation. But most megachurches start ex nihilo. They're created out of nothing. The Reformation was not a creation of new churches out of nothing. It was a reformation. There were existing churches that were reformed. So they existed materially before the Reformation, but not formally. Whereas non-denominational churches, it's in the name non-denominational. It shouldn't be hard to explain why they're not Protestant. It's like the Ben Shapiro meme where that feminist asks him, where is it written that girls can't be Boy Scouts? And Ben's like, in the name Boy Scouts. So where is it written that non-denominationals aren't Protestant? In the name non-denominational. So if you remove them from the equation, Protestantism begins to look a lot more like Catholicism and Orthodoxy in having reverent worship and churches that look like churches and look like a sacred space. So that is all I really wanted to convey in my response video to you. I wasn't saying you were dumb. I wasn't saying that you were even wrong. I was just saying, make sure you understand that Protestantism, properly speaking, is not like that.
I find no offense. I loved the video. I've watched it multiple times now. And
okay, cool.
I think that your clarification on it was actually something I really needed to hear as I was stepping into the YouTube space. And in that video, these are things that I was somewhat feeling and observing in my own life and kind of having these convictions about. I had no idea that I was stepping into this huge conversation that has been happening for the past couple of years amongst YouTube, amongst like articles. I kind of just ducked my head below water. I was working on my business at the time. I was newly married. I had gotten out of seminary and I was trying to take a deep breath from just like theology and church. And I kind of just wanted to be like a normal guy for a second. And so when I had made that video, I had no idea that this was happening. And I knew better to cast Protestantism as like this huge kind of umbrella term for all these different things. And the non-denominational kind of like you would say evangelical Baptist sect is the largest version of Protestantism. And I do think that when people are thinking about Protestantism here in America, they are thinking about that mega church model. And so that is, it's interesting, but I was so glad that you actually gave me some kind of clarifications and I totally agreed with your sentiment. And now as I'm making my videos, I take that into account of like, hey, there are a lot of churches that are doing things much differently than this mega church model. And to term them in the same category is the same thing. And we're going to go like, welcome to Redeem Zuber. If you've never heard of him, this is why I love this guy, is what you just heard. And we're going to get into all kinds of that stuff.
I appreciate it.
But before we get into, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say you're absolutely right. You did step into this big conversation because for 3 years, I've observed a lot of evangelical young men go up this pipeline. Usually it's from evangelical to Reformed Baptist to Presbyterian to Anglican and then to Rome or the East. And I've been the guy who has stayed the same denomination this whole time, as long as I've been Christian, trying to say, guys, you can be Protestant and have pretty churches and sacraments that actually do something and large institutions, but the vast majority of people haven't listened to me. So you made this video, you were touching on something that a lot of people have already been waking up to for years. So I think that just sort of, it was a match in a fireworks factory, you know?
Yeah, and it was just so interesting that I was just coming to my own conclusion, just happened to post the video and was like, yeah, welcome. And I was like, oh, okay. And so yeah, I just got thrown in the deep water. But and yeah, like you said, like you can be Protestant with all of those things, but you don't need the magisterium, you don't need the Pope, you don't need praying to saints, you don't need Mary. And so I think that you can have all those things, but not have to deal with all the other extremities that we don't see in the Bible. You could have both, and that's what the Protestant Reformation was for.
Right. I would push back on one thing. I would say you do need a magisterium, not the infallible magisterium. Traditionally, Lutherans, Anglicans, and Reformed were known as magisterial Protestants. You can't have magisterial Protestants without a magisterium. The difference is it's not an infallible magisterium. It's a reformable magisterium. So I want to say that, like, traditional Protestantism is not free-for-all Christianity. It's basically Catholicism reformed by the Bible, where we still have a lot of the bare bones structures of the Catholic Church with these big institutions that make big decisions. And they still are the normative authority. You know, when people ask, what's your normative authority? Yep, my denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA. That's my normative authority. And it is a magisterium, but it's not an infallible magisterium. So when my magisterium says, hey, gay marriage is okay, I can still read my Bible and say, okay, this is a blatant contradiction. But when my magisterium tells me gambling is a sin, don't gamble, I obey that. The PCUSA, liberal PCUSA, still strictly against all gambling with no exceptions. So yeah, there are Protestant magisteriums. I think it's a good thing. The difference is we don't bind the conscience infallibly. Freedom of conscience is what makes Protestants unique.
Yeah. And that's why you'd have like the councils around the 16th century. And then all of a sudden you have Vatican II that has to like contort and change all their language to try to say like, well, it was infallible back then, but we're just adding on to it when it's definitely
a contradiction, blatant contradiction.
Yeah, but anyways, okay. So I mean, a lot of people maybe have come across your channel. I want to kind of go back. I haven't really heard you talk about your true story of like why you decided on YouTube. I mean, you're an extremely intelligent guy. You know a lot about church history, and you maybe could have written books, which maybe you're working on one, or you could have gone article based, or maybe even ran for. I don't know how the PCA works, but maybe ran for office in the PCA, or maybe even taken a church. PCUSA.
Yeah, PCA is the other one.
Okay.
Yeah.
But why did you decide that maybe going digital, kind of getting on this digital wave was the best way to kind of really get your message out? And where did that start? Where was kind of your conversion story? And then how did it lead you into really making this channel? I want to hear about it.
Okay, lots of questions. I'll try to be brief. So I didn't grow up Christian. I grew up a secular, progressive person in New York. Went to public school for 13 years, so I was like your average New York guy in a very Jewish secular community. I had some exposure to Christianity, but no other Christians my age. In my school where I grew up, absolutely no one, and I mean no one, was religious. Being religious was for grandmas. So I was very secular, very progressive. I adopted the secular progressive ideals of my day. My biggest opposition to Christianity was that it's anti-scientific and bigoted. It's like racist and sexist and homophobic and all that. That was my biggest objection. But I've always been a musician. I play viola. So one time I went to a Christian-themed music camp in the Midwest. And in the Midwest, I actually met other Christians my age for the first time, which I never had really done. And I realized, wait, Christians aren't a bunch of bigots. These are actually more accepting people than I've ever met, like ever back in New York. And I thought Christianity was all anti-scientific. But I met a lot of Presbyterians, and they were actually very intellectual, very scientifically minded Christians. So because the whole anti-scientific thing was my biggest objection to Christianity, I was initially drawn to the Presbyterian church. So that's what I joined when I went home. I joined my local PCUSA Presbyterian church. It was great for a year, but then our pastor retired, and he got replaced with this very liberal lady pastor who began saying a lot of things that didn't sound like Christianity to me. And she said like, oh, the resurrection didn't really happen historically. She began to say, oh, Christianity is not really about what you believe. It's just about what you do. And what you do basically just means social justice. So I was like, yeah, this is a really big problem. And I was getting confirmed at the PCUSA. And then I went on this confirmation retreat hosted by the Presbytery, the regional authority. And that was absolutely insane. One of the pastors didn't believe Jesus was God. Another one of the lady pastors yelled at me for being pro-life and said unborn children are parasites. But I did have a good mentor in my home church, even if we had a liberal pastor. So I went to my mentor and I was like, what the heck is wrong with this denomination? Maybe I should go Catholic. Maybe I should go Eastern Orthodox. And by the way, this was in 2019 before that was cool. Like that was still a bold thing to say back then. And he was like, now listen, our denomination has always been solid historically until the conservatives ran away. The denomination kept getting more liberal because the conservatives kept running away and making the denomination more liberal. So he instilled in me that I have to fight for what I believe in. And I have to not run away from my liberal denomination, the PCUSA. Because although it's sort of hijacked now, it's got centuries and centuries of history of being very faithful to the scripture and to the confessions, to the Reformed confessions. So that's why I'm a PCUSA loyalist. There are smaller schismatic Presbyterian groups, but I don't have anything to do with them because they're schismatics. And the church fathers do say schism is sin. It's a lot of people think it's a Protestant idea that denominations don't matter. If you don't like your denomination, you can split off and form a new one. No, it's not. The reformers agree with the church fathers. You're not allowed to do that. If you're kicked out like Luther was, that's one thing. But your not voluntary schism is sin, is not okay. But I still felt like a lone wolf in my denomination. I was like, okay, there's me, there's my mentor, and there's like a few minority churches. I mean, not like ethnic minority. There's a minority of churches in the denomination that are supposedly still conservative. But I did feel like a lone wolf, and I really wanted to help my denomination, but I didn't know what to do about it. But then when I saw leftism encroach not just on my denomination, but on my friends, a lot of my Christian friends at that summer camp who had converted me ended up converting to like secular leftism. And I saw leftism take over everything else I care about, like the Boy Scouts and even like Star Wars. So I was like, okay, somebody has to do something about this. So I was like, you know what? Maybe I will make my own digital presence because I saw that the left influenced a lot of young people with digital propaganda. So I was like, I'm going to make my own digital propaganda. So that's how I started my Instagram, and then that turned into YouTube. And you asked why I'm doing digital stuff instead of like books and articles. Well, this is not good, but it's the reality that Gen Z doesn't read. Gen Z does not read books or articles. And I think that is very relevant to the apologetics space. There is tons and tons of Catholic and Orthodox propaganda on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube. There's like 100 pretty strong Orthodox apologetics channels and Catholic apologetics channels. Do you know how many Reformed apologetics channels there are?
Would you consider Wesley Huff one?
Well, he's not Reformed, he's Baptist. Do you know how many Reformed apologetics channels there are?
So would you even consider Gavin Reformed?
He's Protestant for sure, and he's
yeah,
great. But he's one man against 100.
Yes.
Well, how many Presbyterian apologetics channels there are? Zero. Not a single one.
Yeah.
So like I actually know a lot of like Presbyterians, these nerdy theology nerds who are more conservative than me, and they often criticize me for being a bit more liberal than them. And they're like, oh, you're not really representing us well. And I'm like, okay, well, how about you step into the YouTube space and you make apologetics content if you're so smart? And they're like, well, I have a blog. Nobody reads blogs. Nobody reads your blog. If you want propaganda, you need to be where people are actually looking at the propaganda. These 13-year-old orthobros who get radicalized by TikToks thinking that they're going to be some crusader by converting to orthodoxy, they're not reading your blog. They are looking at big media online propaganda. So the internet is just how young people learn things, especially because young men are not doing so well in school. Like young men will like not pay attention in their history class, but become experts on history by watching their favorite history YouTube channel. So education has gotten a lot more decentralized, and a lot of young people, especially young men with like a drive to learn, are just teaching themselves a lot of stuff with YouTube. So I think YouTube is actually a much better place to learn these days than most formal learning places. Like even though I'm a college student and I study math, a lot of times my professors are useless and I have to teach myself the concepts on YouTube. So that's why I think YouTube is actually the best place to teach people stuff. And remember, I said my denomination went liberal because conservative Protestants kept retreating from it. There is a big problem in conservative Protestantism. It's retreatism. Not only do they retreat from their own institutions, but they even retreat from the online sphere. And that's why conservative Protestants don't make apologetics content. The only ones who do are kind of like the ones who are maybe not the most historically informed. It just makes the rest of us look bad. So yeah, that's my story from then to now. I started a movement called Operation Reconquista to try and retake the liberal mainline churches. And here we are now.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think I actually take in probably the most information on YouTube right now. My wife and I kind of talk about how addicted I am to YouTube and consuming information. I love guys like Gavin Ortland and listening to podcasts. I do read and I do try to keep up with blogs and whatnot, but I just feel so drawn to the video platform. And I feel like it's a great way to take in information, especially if you're kind of casually listening on your drives and stuff like that. It's great. And something that I kind of want to kind of dive into a little bit is anyone, I think in the Protestant world, it's kind of termed that if anyone is interested in these things, if they're interested in church history, if they're interested in sacraments or liturgy, that they probably should just be a pastor. They should go to seminary. They should be on staff at a local church. And for me, as I'm reading the New Testament, as I'm reading kind of the giftings that Paul lays out, I kind of see there's a variety of different things that the church and the gospel needs to go forward. And it's not every single person needs to be a pastor if they are somewhat interested in these things. I think every Christian, and again, Protestantism maybe is the one that lacks this the most, but every Christian should strive to want to know their Bible more, want to know church history, want to know why the Protestant Reformation happened, want to know about the sacraments, and then use that information to go with the giftings that God has chosen for them. And so like if that's apologetics, if that is the digital space, if that's podcasting, if that's just in your workplace, you have all these tools that you get to use for that. And I think probably guys like you, if I had to guess, it's just like, why don't you become a pastor? You obviously need to be a pastor. Or if you're a pastor, you should be out there doing content, because those are the only guys who actually know what's going on or actually know what the scripture says or what church history says. It's like, no, like I think all of us should know, and then we should do what God has called us to do, if that's YouTube, if that's podcasting. And so what do you think? I guess my proposal is more men need to understand what's actually happening. And then if they're not called to pastoral ministry, maybe they're called to be on YouTube to actually preach to God. We need more apologists on TikToks, on Instagrams, on YouTube. It doesn't have to just be the pastors. And if you like that stuff, you don't have to be a pastor.
Right. I think I'll say two things. The first thing, I totally agree with you. It's a very Protestant idea to have an educated laity. Like, do you know why Sweden and Denmark and Scotland and the Netherlands are so prosperous today, despite the fact that they're atheist? Because the Protestant Reformation taught everyone to read. The Puritans taught young girls to read. Modern people teach young girls to be boys. But the Protestant Reformation greatly increased literacy rates because they wanted everyone to read the Bible. When the Catholics are like, so you want everyone to read the Bible themselves? Literally, yes. Individual liberty of conscience and intellectual freedom leads to the greatest human flourishing. That is exactly what we're trying to do. I'll admit that sometimes liberalism was a byproduct of that, but it's not our fault if we opened Pandora's box of intellectual freedom and now we have to try and fight liberal ideas. They were going to come out eventually. It's good to have a church that's actually prepared to meet those challenges. So yes, it looks different now. Right now, Protestantism looks like a joke compared to Catholicism and Orthodoxy, especially when you include non-denominational churches under Protestant, which I don't. But it used to be, just in the 1800s, every Protestant family, every Presbyterian family, for example, the father would personally teach his kids the entire Westminster Shorter Catechism. And in Lutheran families, the father would personally teach his kids the entire, like Luther's Small Catechism, the Augsburg Confession. And back then, in Catholic families, the mother would say, "Pray to this Aztec skeleton for good luck," in Mexican countries. So in like countries like Mexico. So Catholicism has improved itself by becoming more Protestant. Now, Catholicism and Orthodoxy accept this idea of an educated laity. They didn't used to do that. In Catholicism and Orthodoxy, used to be only the clergy, like the priests or monks or nuns. They should study the scriptures. If you're a laity, just do the rituals, go through the motions, don't commit mortal sin, and you'll be fine. And that's why, to this day, Roman Catholic and especially Eastern Orthodox countries have a much lower human development index than Protestant countries. Now, the idea that it doesn't need to be pastors that do apologetics, I might push back on that a little bit, because the Catholics and Orthodox, they have both priests and laity who make apologetics. Like, the priests will be the primary producers of apologetics content. The laity can easily learn from them and mimic them, because seminary education is important, especially the mainline seminaries. I think the reason that our butts get kicked in debate is because Protestants have been alienated from their own seminaries. The mainline seminaries of Protestantism, like Harvard and Yale and Princeton, they are equal caliber to like the Catholic seminaries, and they can teach an equal level of historical analysis. However, the evangelical Protestant seminaries, which were formed out of retreat from the mainline seminaries, they have far less resources, far less historical awareness. That's why tons of Protestants who even studied at an evangelical seminary will still convert to Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Like, this is what happens to like Jay Dyer, for example. He went to a small retreatist Reformed seminary, Bonson Seminary, and then he was exposed to just like YouTube Catholic arguments, and that made him convert. And then he converted to YouTube Orthodoxy later on. I mean, he converted to Orthodoxy based on YouTube later on. I'm not saying he wasn't genuine. I'm just saying evangelical Protestant seminaries don't teach people anything. The mainline seminaries teach you everything. They just don't enforce actual faith fidelity to it. So I'd say the mainline churches, the liberal institutional mainline Protestant churches, are able but unwilling to defend Protestantism, and the evangelical offshoot retreatists are willing but unable. Does that make sense?
Kind of, yeah. What would be your plan for producing more people on the field? Maybe building up the laity. Would you? I mean, obviously, you said seminaries are a great thing, but maybe everyone can't go to seminary or go to the mainline, like you were just talking about. So, how do we build up those people to go and commission? Because yeah, like you said, on YouTube, we are getting kind of our butts kicked because there are so many great, just knowledgeable. I mean, we have Trent Horn on the Catholic side. I'd say Orthodox is maybe in a similar vein as us. I don't see very many Orthodox apologists either that are
Really?
yeah, maybe I haven't come across them yet.
You have no, like, have you watched Jay Dyer?
I haven't. No.
Oh, you
Am I about
no,
to
there's
enter it a
tons
completely
of
okay. Okay.
there's
Well, I'm about to
tons of
get
Orthodox. And the thing is, they're really smart. Like Jay Dyer, he is really smart. He's a
okay.
genius, and he knows how. He's sort of like an entertainer as well. So he'll be like, obviously, absolute divine simplicity compromises the incarnation. Don't understand the divine energies, dummy. So like that's what he's like.
Okay. Yeah, you'll have to send me those. I mean,
So like
I'm already like
there's Jay
overwhelmed
Dyer,
with
Luigi
info.
Kyle, Ubi Petrus, who else is there? Telos Bound, tons of big Orthodox apologetics accounts. I'd say they're equal caliber to Catholicism. What's more is that Catholicism actually has the resources to fund apologetics. Like Catholic Answers, they get funding. I mean, Trent Horn is a great guy. He took me out to a cheeseburger with Catholic money. So somewhere along the way, some of those Catholic indulgences paid for my cheeseburger. Yeah, like Protestants have abandoned our institutions that have money. We still have the institutions, but the Protestants who give a crap are not in those institutions. So there's no funding for any apologetics. So you asked me what my solution is. We need a few really smart guys to go to the mainline seminaries, which we are doing through my movement, Operation Reconquista. I know some guys who are going to Yale Divinity School and already have learned enough to obliterate all the Catholic apologetics. You just have to get through seminary. Like, I'll just tell you one fact I learned from one of my Yale student friends. Celtic Christianity for the first few centuries was Presbyterian. They didn't have bishops. When Christianity was spread to that land, they didn't have bishops, and the bishops came over later. So that means early Scottish Christianity in like the first few centuries of the church was actually closer to Presbyterianism than to Catholicism. That's just one of many, many facts that you learn at those mainline seminaries, which you don't learn at evangelical seminaries who think church history started in 1500. But anyway, we need a few people to do that. Once we do that, then it will sort of be a domino effect. Then lay theologians like you and me, who have not gone to seminary, will have more easily accessible resources to start making content. But really, I don't think in Protestantism any help can come from the evangelicals. I think that if Protestantism is going to be fixed at all, the only hope is reviving the mainline churches, because the mainline churches are what our Protestant ancestors invested in for centuries. They spent centuries donating all their money, donating their whole lives to building up these institutions. I think it's a dishonor to their heritage to just try and split off and start from scratch and reinvent the wheel.
Gotcha. So would you say we should almost like promote this as like a system of um, evangelical efforts and apologetic efforts, that men would actually go out of their way to study these things for the gospel because they know that they have this passion, they know they have kind of this intellectual bent, but for the maybe for the digital space or more, yeah, like would you say that we should actually promote that as like a way of living out your life that we've never really seen or we haven't seen?
Maybe. I don't think we need men to do this just for anti-Catholic or anti-Orthodox
Yeah,
apologists.
yeah,
I think we just need strong young leaders in the Protestant church. And when I say Protestant church, I mean mainline Protestant church, generally speaking. But
yep.
that will automatically include also providing good counter arguments to the propaganda we see from Catholics and Orthodox on the internet. Like in general, the whole Operation Reconquista movement, which we already got thousands of people in, is encouraging young men to join these mainline Protestant denominations and become leaders in these mainline Protestant denominations. We have the manpower to take over all these liberal churches within a generation. The question is, are young men willing to do something? Are young men willing to have something to fight for? And this is an actual crusade, that, like a non-violent crusade, young men can actually embark on and actually take over something, rather than just LARPing on TikTok and saying, we're going to retake Jerusalem or retake Constantinople. Okay, have fun. We are actually doing something in real life.
Yeah, absolutely. You said a couple times now about the non-denominational. This is something that I feel like I've watched your content stretching back for a while, and I think you've gotten more and more bold about this proclamation as
Oh,
you've,
yeah.
I think as you've been more certain. But the non-denominational is not it should not be in the Protestant bucket anymore. And you've even admitted that we do follow the solas. But I want to give you just this time and freedom to give your best sales pitch about why maybe it should be in a different bucket, and it doesn't
Okay.
quite follow Protestantism to its full capacity, and it's actually drawing more confusion than it's actually helping the Protestant movement.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. I think really we need to think of a solid definition of Protestant. That needs to be the starting place. Um, a lot of people think Protestant is just this miscellaneous category of any church that calls itself Christian that's like not Catholic or Orthodox. But that's kind of meaningless. A category that's defined by a negative quality could have infinite elements to it. So if I start a cult in my basement, is that Protestant? Mormonism, is that Protestant? Jehovah's Witness, is that Protestant? The weird South Korean God the Mother cult that appears on your college campuses, is that Protestant? So if Protestantism can include absolutely anything, if it's just a negative category of not Catholic or Orthodox, then it's pointless to even talk about. It's pointless to even talk about Protestantism. So if that's how you define it, then it doesn't mean anything to say there's 40,000 Protestant denominations if you're defining Protestant as just this miscellaneous category. My response to that is there's 40,000 Chalcedonian denominations because there's one Miaphysite denomination, the Oriental Orthodox, and they barely ever split. But there's 40,000 Chalcedonian denominations. That includes the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics and the Protestants. So yeah, if a category is just a negative thing, it's meaningless. Now, some people might say, okay, maybe let's define Protestantism as the five solas. So any church that adheres to the five solas is Protestant. But the thing is, where are you getting that from? Where are you getting this idea that the five solas defines Protestantism? Because the five solas, as like this set of things, didn't exist until the 20th century. Like, yeah, during the Reformation, people believed in sola scriptura and sola fide. There was really two solas. Like, who's going to disagree with soli deo gloria? Like, no, I don't think we should glorify God. Like, seriously, I feel like that was just added to the end of the list to sound cool. So, no, the five solas historically did not define Protestantism. So, what defines Protestantism? Well, it ain't rocket surgery. What defines Protestantism is the Protestant Reformation, where a bunch of Catholics in the Catholic Church protested the leadership of the Catholic Church. And for protesting the leadership of the Roman Catholic Church, these Catholics were forcibly kicked out of the Roman Catholic Church. So then you had a bunch of Catholics who were outside of the Roman Catholic Church for protesting the Roman Catholic Church, and that's how they got the name Protestant. So Protestants are Catholics in protest of the Pope. It makes no sense to call someone a Protestant if they're not rooted in the Catholic Church. Otherwise, what are you protesting? It's not like some random guy who starts a church in his basement could be like, I'm protesting the Pope. Okay, if this protesting the Pope just means you don't agree with the Pope, okay. Or Sikh mystics in Tibet, are they protesting the Pope? Are they Protestant now? Like, guess what? I protest the Dalai Lama because I don't agree with him. So yeah, the best way to understand why non-denominationals aren't Protestant is to realize that any definition of Protestant that includes them is literally meaningless. So what I would say is Protestantism is a historical category, not a theological category. And I think the biggest error of evangelicalism is defining Christianity as purely propositional rather than participatory. That's why evangelicals who convert to like more high church Protestantism will say, oh, I'm a Lutheran today. Not because I go to a Lutheran church, because I agree with Lutheran ideas. It's like, that doesn't make you Lutheran. If I decide I believe in transubstantiation purgatory, that doesn't automatically make me a Roman Catholic. So Protestantism is not a set of ideas. Protestantism is a set of institutions that formed out of a specific historical moment. So I have a historical definition of Protestant, not a theological definition of Protestant. So if it doesn't make sense, it's not fair to compare Catholics to Protestants if you're defining Catholicism as an institution and Protestantism as a set of vaguely defined ideas. Then you're comparing apples and oranges. The only way to have any meaningful dialogue between Catholics and Protestants is if they both have a historical institutional definition. So I would say a Protestant church is an institution with roots in the Protestant Reformation. That includes Presbyterians, that includes Lutherans, that includes the Dutch Reformed, that includes some Baptists. There are some Baptists that are from the Church of England, and there's a lot of Baptists that just spawn out of nowhere. So with Baptists, it's hard. So I'd say like mainline American Baptists, even traditional Southern Baptists can be considered Protestant. Random Billy Bob's Independent Bible Baptist Church that formed out of nowhere in Idaho, no, that's not Protestant. So a lot of non-denominational churches will have Baptist theology, and they'll say, okay, why can't we be Baptist? If we have, the thing is, it's not just theology that defines a category. It's also history and institutions. Because if you're defining Catholicism by an institution and Protestantism as a set of vague ideas, again, you're comparing apples and oranges. Then it makes no sense to criticize Protestantism if Protestantism could include absolutely anything. So that's what I would say. That's why I'd say non-denominationals aren't Protestant. That's just the first reason. I gave you the historical reason. Now there's some theological reasons. Because there are some core beliefs that basically everyone in the Reformation held to, that basically no non-denominationals hold to. The first belief is the belief that the sacraments actually save you. Even traditional Baptists sort of believed this, that baptism is not just a symbol. Communion is not just a symbol. God works real grace through these things, and they are ordinarily necessary for salvation. They're normatively necessary for salvation. Not absolutely necessary, because they're like, what about the thief on the cross? Not absolutely necessary. Normatively necessary for salvation. So what the reformers would always say is it's not the want of sacraments, but the condemnation of sacraments that damns you. So if you just don't have an opportunity to get baptized or receive the Lord's Supper, you're not damned for that. But if you actually reject baptism and reject the Lord's Supper consciously, there is no way you have saving faith. That's what the reformers would say. It's completely compatible with justification by faith alone. So that's one thing that really separates Protestants from non-denominational churches. And some person will say, oh, my non-denominational church believes in the sacraments. And if you investigate their case, what they mean is I believe in the sacraments because I watched a Lutheran video and my pastor has no idea what a sacrament is. That's usually what it means. The second thing is that Protestantism saw itself as the Catholic Church reformed by the Bible. So they still had a very institutional definition of the church. And like I said, they still believed voluntary schism is wrong. So they didn't have this concept of the church the way evangelicals do, where you can start a new church for any reason whatsoever. And as long as you're vaguely following your personal interpretation of the Bible, it's perfectly valid. So when people criticize Protestantism, they're really criticizing evangelicalism. So I would define Protestantism as institutions rooted in the Catholic Church that are reformed by the Bible that don't see the Roman magisterium as infallible. Whereas evangelicalism is the idea that denominations don't matter. So if someone thinks denominations don't matter, if a specific church doesn't really care what denomination it's part of, or doesn't even try to be in a denomination, that's not Protestantism. That's evangelicalism. Evangelicalism is this free-for-all Christianity that all of Protestantism gets labeled with. So yeah, those are basically the theological and historical reasons why there is absolutely no coherent definition that would include non-denominationals as Protestant.
Yeah. One of these things are not like the other, right? And yeah, I mean, obviously, I go to a non-denominational church that is bent Southern Baptist, and so I went to SBC, so or SBTS, and I would consider myself Southern Baptist. And they are part of the convention, but they determine that they're non-denominational. And I'm starting to really believe that you can't just make up all of your own definitions and try to term yourself, but no one around you looks the same as you or has anything to do with the way that you are constructing it. It doesn't look like anything in church history. It doesn't look like anything like the mainlines. And somewhere, maybe you can help me with the history on this, but I keep tracking back to about the 1960s, 1950s of a sect of the American Christian world determined that they did not want to look like the mainline Protestant churches, and they wanted to separate and create something different.
Yes.
How could you have that vision, and how could you have that sentiment of, we do not want this to look like church? We want it to somewhat look like culture. We want to go into culture, and what I keep coming back to is the Jesus movement. But we want to we want to allow the culture to kind of come in and feel comfortable and do its own thing. And we want to not have accountability towards any of the mainlines. We want to somewhat come up with our own theology. We want to instill our own pastors. We want to have no kind of what you said magisterium, not an infallible magisterium, but somewhat of an institutional structure in which if things are wrong, if you can call foul on something, you have an institution that can do that. But you have all of these separate churches that have completely their own structures, completely their own institutions. You have these mega church pastors who are going wild and don't have to be accountable to anyone. How could you also say, I want that? I want no accountability. I want no magisterium. I want to be able to completely do my own thing and not have to study church history whatsoever and come up with a completely new worship that has never been seen before. But I also want to be called Protestant. It's
Right.
like, it's like moving to Canada and completely creating your own civilization and then saying, hey, I still want to be American. It's like, well, I don't know if that's how it works, though, because it doesn't look anything like America.
Right. Yeah, if you're just defining Protestant as not Catholic. So it's not like the evangelicals are descended, like literally physically from the Anabaptists, but they have the same ideas as the Anabaptists. And the Protestant reformers all strongly condemned Anabaptists more strongly than they condemned the Catholics, by the way. They considered Anabaptists more heretical than Catholics. So for exactly the same reasons, everything the reformers condemned the Anabaptists for are things that characterize all of evangelicalism, such as not believing the sacraments, having a free-for-all church structure. And by the way, congregationalism shouldn't be confused with a free-for-all church structure. Congregationalism is where the local church is autonomous, but they still often fellowship with each other. So like the United Church of Christ is a congregationalist denomination. It's not a free-for-all. So yeah, the Anabaptists had free-for-all Christianity. They often had a lot of enthusiasm where there were these large emotional movements that would rally up crowds that weren't really based in anything historic. They often did deny a lot of historic theology. There was a lot of Nestorianism among the Anabaptists who didn't really believe Mary was the mother of God. And obviously, there was the whole infant baptism thing. The traditional Baptists out of the Church of England, they're making every effort to try and say, we are not like those Anabaptists. We are just like radical nonconformist Congregationalists. And to some extent, there is a difference. So I would say a traditional Northern Baptist church, from Rhode Island that founded Brown University, I would say, yeah, that's more of a traditional Baptist church. They're not Anabaptists. But your average, like, Bible believing Southern Baptist, not even Southern Baptist, your average independent fundamental Baptist church in the middle of Arkansas, like, yeah, that's Anabaptist. Okay, that is not Protestant. So you're absolutely right. And you're right about the Jesus People movement and the Calvary Chapel, which was formed out of that. It was specifically trying to create a brand new church that doesn't feel like church to appeal to hippies from California. I've met evangelicals who will staunchly defend this. They're like, shouldn't we reach all people? Yeah, but you don't change the church to reach people. If I'm trying to, like, that's kind of like a flip side of what the mainlines do, saying, oh, we need to make the church more gay to appeal to the gay community. Like, no, you should reach out to all communities. You should be present in all communities. You shouldn't, like, isolate yourself from the communities. That doesn't mean you change the liturgy to appeal to different communities. So that is completely unjustifiable, and it kind of vindicates what I've been saying, because it is a self-conscious new form of church. It is self-consciously a rebellion against the institutional mainline Protestantism.
Yeah. And your interview with Matthew Everhard opened me up to kind of terming a lot of this stuff. And then I read Worshiptainment, and it has just pushed this conversation even farther. And I think non-denominationalism in kind of the seeker sense of movement has to come to terms with, we've never had a church that looks like this. And so you have to come to a conclusion of, why did we decide this? And if you look, basically you have two choices. You either look into church history and try to come up with a liturgy that is like it looks like our founding fathers and what they have established, or you see the new church and you say, well, it kind of looks more like the world. And you better have a really good reason why you made a new church that looks like the world, rather than trying to comprehend why you would just uproot the traditional, what we've decided on for 2,000 years. Like, it makes no sense. And I just, Worshiptainment really kind of gave me language to use, visions, or like kind of imagery of like what this means. And I want you to kind of talk about this too, of that the worship service here in America, this might be somewhat of a new idea to Christians that are coming up, but the worship service isn't about you. It has never been about you. It's to be about God. And I want to talk from your experience of beauty, of liturgy, of sacraments, and how to actually, if you've thought about this, how to actually institute a liturgy that's actually focused on God instead of focused on yourself and focused on your feelings, and why the focused on feelings part is maybe doomed to fail compared to an actual people who are trying to focus on their liturgy towards God that is never deemed to fail. Like that will always work. This side will never, it will run its course. And I'll stack on top of that one more little question for you, because I love when you just kind of go on your ranch. But one more question. What do you think, if you've put some thought into this, it seems like your language toward non-denominational is getting more and more aggressive. So I feel like you've thought about this more and more. What do you think is the true future of the non-denominational church in America if they keep going down this route? If they keep trying to look more and more like the culture, if they keep focusing on your feelings rather than actually instituting God, and they keep getting away from church history and away from like traditional Protestantism, what do you think? And you could be as gracious as you want, or you could be as harsh as you want, but your true observation, where is this going?
Yeah, I'm going to use some colorful rhetoric about non-denominationalism. So first, I'll try and steelman their arguments, because I have talked to a lot of people who really defend this type of Christianity. So their mindset is just, the radical evangelical idea is the only thing that matters is salvation by faith alone and saving souls. They have a very Gnostic view of the world. The only thing that matters is getting souls into heaven. So, and it is true that non-denominational churches are good at growing church membership. They still are the fastest growing church. It's like Catholics and Orthodox are growing fast among like intellectual Christians, among Christians who really want to dig deep into Christianity. But a lot of people aren't interested in that. A lot of people just, want their fellowship on Sunday. So non-denominational churches are legitimately good at reaching people and getting people to believe in sola fide, and that's it. A lot of people think that's all that really matters in Christianity. So if that's your starting presupposition, then non-denominationalism is the best form of Christianity, because it's not restricted by any bureaucracy. It's completely decentralized. It's almost capitalist in that anyone can just leave a church at any moment. So you have to constantly be getting people in. It creates competition between churches. It's like if capitalism was Christianity. So yeah, if you don't believe that the transformation of the earth here matters at all, the way the Protestants did, if you believe the only purpose of Christianity is escaping this horrible world to go to heaven, which is influenced by rapture theology and dispensationalism, then yeah, non-denominationalism is great. The problem is that's not what the Protestant reformers believe, because that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that Christianity is about the kingdom of God here on earth and having a transformative impact. Okay, let me try and remember what your questions were. So you're talking about this liturgy, this tradition and beauty and stuff. Now, I'm not actually an expert in like architecture or aesthetics. All I know is that in the Bible, worship is a royal thing. Worship is something you give to a king. God is King of Kings. Like it can be hard for Americans to understand this because we don't have a king, but it's a universal throughout all cultures. The honor you give to a king is very ceremonial and reverent. So I don't think there's just one liturgy that churches need to adopt. There's always been different liturgies throughout history. The thing is, whatever it is, it needs to be reverent. And until modern evangelicalism, it always was reverent. Like, can you imagine singing CCM to like Emperor Constantine, like, oh, Emperor Constantine, you are so, so good. Like Emperor Constantine would have been like, okay, barbarians, come and take this land. I give up. If people were saying that stuff, then and it's like grown men feel like they're effeminate babies. It's like kindergarten music when they're singing the CCM. It's like I've never seen like a grown man sing those songs with a straight face. It feels, I can smell the cognitive dissonance among non-denominationals who are conservative and they want like a traditional family and they're all about return to tradition. And Sunday morning it's like blue lights and sing like, oh, 1,000 reasons. So
are you monitoring my calls and text messages? Like what? Like you're in like every conversation that I've been having recently.
It's common sense.
I look around.
I want to say great minds think alike, but I really say common sense thinks alike because everyone is thinking this. I'm just the one who's not nice enough to not say it. To not say
I
it
was
live.
just talking to someone about this not too long ago. I was just like, man, if you don't believe me, just look around on Sunday morning and look at the men's eyes. Just look around while we're worshiping, and they're halfway dead. Like you could definitely just tell, like, what are we doing? Like, why am I here? Like, what is this? And so, yeah, keep going.
Yeah, that'll make a good tweet. I might tweet this later. I've never seen a grown man sing CCM with a straight face. But the other thing is like, people obsess over the details. It's like, oh, what do you mean you want something more beautiful? Do you want like to chant in Latin? Do you want robes? Do you want smells and bells? No. People often conflate beauty with like high church. No, traditional low church Christianity was very beautiful. The most low church type of Christianity is like Congregationalist and Baptist. I'll invite you all to New York. Come to New York with me. Visit a historic Baptist or Congregationalist church. There's no icons, there's no altar, no robes, no incense that makes you sneeze, and it's beautiful. It's simple, but it's beautiful because it's reverent, because they're going there to worship the King of the universe. So beauty does not mean high church. Yes, there are some high church Protestants like Lutherans and Anglicans, but the rest of like most American Protestants, like Presbyterians and Methodists and Congregationalists and Baptists, they're low church. They still build churches that look like huge castles. Why? Because God is king. Because Jesus is king. Because Christianity is not about your personal feelings or about going to heaven. It's about the kingdom of heaven here on earth. And Jesus is king. That's what Christianity is about. And yes, Jesus is going to come back and we're going to live with him forever. So yeah, there's a sense of going to heaven. And yes, there's the whole intermediate state with the body and soul. But the point is the kingdom is here now. The kingdom is not something that only starts when you die. So we should treat Jesus like a king and we should sing anthems to a king. Why do national anthems sound like hymns? Because hymns are national anthems, or hymns are anthems to the king. Like in my traditional PCUSA church back in New York, a lot of hymns were actually called anthems. We would say, we're going to sing our anthem now. Not like just one anthem, but an anthem is like a royal hymn. So that's why I think this is going to be bold. Like I am going off the script here. I think despite, like even when a mainline church has a female pastor, the sum total of the worship is less effeminate than non-denominational churches, even when there is a female pastor, which, my pastor is a conservative man. So what about the future of non-denominationalism? I want to be clear. When I'm giving them this advice, I'm not giving non-denominational churches advice on how to improve, because I don't think they can improve. Some people think, you're about Reconquista. I'm going to Reconquista my non-denominational church. That's not how it works. Reconquista has a re in it. You're trying to restore something to its roots. If its roots are a conscious rebellion against, you can't try and change something into something it was never meant to be. I'm not going to go into the local Mormon church and try to Reconquista into a Nicene Christian church. My advice to people is just leave Mormon churches. So I'm not going to bind people's conscience. I'm not going to say everyone has to leave non-denominationalism. But what I will say is if you want even a shred of historic Christianity, you can't be non-denominational. And the future non-denominationalism, there's what I hope and what I fear. What I hope is for it to mostly stop existing. And if it exists, just to be a fringe thing. And Jordan Cooper has said the same thing. This is not just Yankee boy being a jerk. Jordan Cooper he's also a Yankee. This is not just me, though. A lot of people have said this. And the reformers, Martin Luther, you watch the Luther movie, like I see non-denominationals watching the Luther movie on Halloween. He would on Fall Festival Jesus Ween, they would say the same thing. Luther would say the same thing, even though a lot of non-denominationals pretend to be following in his footsteps. Maybe if you're in Somalia and there's persecution all around, you need to make an underground church. Yeah, you don't need to be affiliated with like the PCUSA. Fine. But in America, there's no excuse for non-denominational churches. There's no excuse for church plants. That's what I hope. What's my fear? My fear is that non-denominationalism basically replaces Protestantism and the rich Protestant heritage becomes forgotten. One of my biggest arguments against CCM is not just that it's like sounds silly and effeminate, even though it does. It's that it makes people forget the Protestant style of music. Protestants made their own style of hymns. Every hymn you've probably heard, like list a famous hymn right now.
Come Thou Fount.
Yeah, that's a Protestant hymn. Every famous hymn is Protestant because Protestants invented 4-part harmony. Why? So the congregation could sing together. In the Catholic Church, the congregation would just be in the pews, and trained singers, a lot of young men who were castrated, by the way, would sing this complex polyphony. And it sounds beautiful, but the congregation can't participate in that. The hymns were written with simple rhythms, but still beautiful 4-part harmony, which sounds like angel choirs, like in the book of Revelation, so the congregation could participate in that. The best composer ever, I'm a musician, and everyone agrees the best composer ever was Bach. He was a Protestant. Handel's Messiah, probably the best Christian piece ever written, was written by Handel. He was a Protestant. Every famous hymn was written by like an Anglican or a Methodist. They're Protestants. So what non-denominationalism is doing right now is it's causing everyone to forget that Protestantism exists. That is my fear. So my fear is that non-denominationalism is going to keep getting more oversimplified, because you have to admit our culture is getting dumber. This isn't the fault of non-denominationals. It's just what's happening. But if you have a church that tries to mimic the style of the culture, it's going to keep getting dumber and dumber. So in 2050, your non-denominational mega church is going to give a sermon about skibbity toilet or something. I don't know. I wouldn't put it past that. They have Star Wars churches and like Taylor Swift themed church events. I wouldn't put it past them to have like a skibbity toilet themed church event, especially when Gen Alpha grows up. So yeah, have you seen the movie Idiocracy?
A lot of clips. I know it's become very popular since Trump has been reelected, but yes, I know the premise. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
how spot on they were.
That's what's going to happen to our churches. So I don't really care if a few non-denominational churches exist. It's like, it's not my job to be the spiritual police. The problem is when they start to replace Protestants, which they are doing, then we have to stand up for our heritage. And we have to say there is a Christianity that is rooted in scripture alone and faith alone that doesn't look like that. That is actually reverent.
And that, I mean, you make a great point. There's really only 3 scenarios. And if Protestant or non-denominational churches were to actually project themselves 20 years in the future with the actual patterns that could happen. 1, it becomes the most successful sect of Protestant Protestantism in the next 20 years. And what does that look like? That looks like extremely divided, a very cultural looking church by the American standards, and no institution whatsoever for accountability, main discipleship, agreement on anything. And so, like, if it becomes super successful, is that a world we want to live in, where this is the dominant version of Christianity in the West? And like, man, if it's a fringe thing, like, I'm all for somewhat of a variety of different churches. Like you said, there's a bunch of different liturgies that we can decide on, as long as they're intentional and as long as they're reverent. There's not a one, like, we didn't get in scripture, out of all the things Paul said, he did not lay out an exact liturgy for us. So there is variety in that, but it needs to be intentional, needs to be reverent.
Right.
And so if it becomes extremely successful, ouch. If it becomes incredibly fringe, it might die out. And so I'm very curious to see what that would look like. Would you say
like
that
the 1800s before it existed? We know what it's going to look like if it dies out.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe speak about what you're seeing. So me and you were probably in similar conversations with young men wanting to be they're wanting something much different than maybe what the non-denominational is known for. And something I was talking to a friend of mine about is that a lot of non-denominational churches right now will justify themselves as being different from the other non-denominational mega churches. So like, we're not Elevation, we're not Transformation Church, we're not Joel Osteen's church, and we actually preach from the Bible. And something I was thinking about a lot, it was like the actual reality that a non-believer would know the difference between an actual local church who is non-denominational, that still does the rock band TED Talk type of vibe. The odds of a non-believer knowing the difference between that and the difference between an Elevation is probably so slim, even though maybe those who are mature are like, okay, well, I know that my pastor's actually preaching expositionally. He's actually opening up the word of God. Maybe we're doing vertical worship instead of horizontal worship. We don't play Elevation. And so there are little nuances that it's like, okay, well, we're actually not going all that way. We don't have this huge Easter production. But I think non-believers paint us all with the same exact brush. And I think even though we're not doing those things, we're still getting the reputation of the Elevation. And and as young men are coming in, we're like, well, we have a lot more to offer the motivated young men who's going to the Orthodox and Catholics, but they don't even give us the time of day because we're in the same category. And I don't think a lot of non-denominational people take that into account. That, okay, say in America right now, you're a traditional liberal. You're not on the fringe left, but you still consider yourself a liberal, and you are still voting in those ways. You are still with liberals, though. Like, you're being painted with the same brush. And in the political realm, the traditional liberals are saying, hey, we have to completely take this bar back, or we're losing the whole entire thing. Like, it's not even something we can play with anymore. If we don't figure out how to tame this beast, then we've all lost. The world is painting us in the same exact light, no matter where on the spectrum we're laying. And I don't think non-denominational understands that the spectrum has gone so far, to the Star Wars, to the Taylor Swifts, that people are just completely even looking over non-denominational going forward. And the whole thing is going to fall apart. And I see that as our actual future.
Sure. I agree. And I also think that you bring up a good point, because I will get messages from people that are like, my non-denominational church isn't like that. Like, let's pretend hypothetically there's a non-denominational church that's like does everything right, that has even a pretty building, which almost never happens. Let's say they did, and they had hymns. Like, I know of like maybe 3 non-denominational churches in the world that are like that. It's okay. What about that? Well, even if it is like that, because I know a lot of these like base trad masculinity pastors on Twitter will start their own cult churches, and they really do care about having a pretty church. So they'll rent out some like old Methodist building, and they'll sing masculine psalms and stuff, which is good. That's fine. And then they usually are like radically misogynist, and that's not okay. But even when that happens, even if there are a few good non-denominational churches, why are you presupposing that we should evaluate churches on a congregational basis rather than an institutional basis? Like, I would still rather go to a contemporary PCUSA church. Those do exist. They're the minority. I'd rather go to a contemporary PCUSA church than a traditional non-denominational church, because my loyalty is to the institution, not to the congregation. It's a very evangelical mindset to say that to atomize the church, that every congregation is just its own little thing doing whatever it wants. So even if there is a good non-denominational church, by sort of justifying the existence of non-denominationalism and downplaying the existence of institutional denominations, they're enabling the rest of non-denominationalism. So even if there is a good non-denominational church, the fact that they exist just enables other non-denominational churches to be like the Joel Osteen mega churches. Because if your based masculine Twitter pastor can start a nice masculine non-denominational church that preaches biblical values, which is really just cultural conservatism, then what's stopping Joel Osteen from starting his non-denominational church that preaches your best life now? So we need to return to the model of the first 1900 years of Christianity, where the church had to be affiliated with some institution to be given any credibility. And it's a myth that there were no denominations before Luther. No, there's always been different denominations of Christians. In Emperor Justinian's time, Justinian was trying to hold a balance between the Chalcedonian denomination and the Miaphysite denomination and the Nestorian denomination. All of them were considered valid Christians in the eyes of the emperor, and they were all not getting along. Like Justinian was a Chalcedonian, his wife was a Miaphysite. So there's always been different denominations of Christianity. Now, Chalcedonianism has greatly, greatly surpassed Miaphysites and Nestorians. And a lot of evangelicals have more Nestorian theology than the literal Nestorian church itself. But there's always been a plurality of Christian sects. But it's always been recognized that a church needs to be clearly identified as part of some institution to be worth the time of day, unless you are persecuted. Persecution is one thing, but it's expected that once the persecution ends, the churches will actually be given some legitimacy. So it's like, again, if you're in North Korea, if you're watching this and you're in North Korea or you're in Somalia, go to whatever church you can find, if you can even go at all, because that is often very dangerous. But if you're in America, there is no excuse.
Yeah. And I'm ever more convinced here recently that, I mean, even as a man, as a young 20-year-old man, like the more accountability, the more overarching leadership that I have to keep myself theologically, spiritually, to my wife, I need as much support as I can get. And to think that a charismatic leader, so basically what I heard you say there is, once you throw out the idea of the institution, it's not that one man can't be somewhat tamed above reproach in and of himself with his elders. It's the fact that when you cast out the institution, that means like 2,000 men have to have all this self-discipline, really good theological foundation, amazing elders behind them, a congregation that will hold them accountable. Because if it all falls apart, the whole congregation is screwed. And you have no institution in which to actually sort these things out. And then you have this charismatic man who can do whatever he wants, and there's nothing holding him back. And all throughout history, that is like a bad idea. That is not a good idea.
Do you want me to give you an example of when that actually happened?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, when I was in college, I was near this church. I actually went to it twice. I went to one of the good non-denominational churches. It was a non-denominational church. Yeah, they met in some warehouse, but they sang hymns. They didn't sing CCM. They sang masculine hymns. And it was straight expository Bible preaching. It was Reformed. I mean, I don't think so now, but they call themselves Reformed. It was Trinity Bible Church, Steve Lawson's church. So that's an example of one of the good non-denominational churches, but who's centered around the personality of Steve Lawson. So after he had his whole scandal, I know a lot of people from that church who are telling me, like, I am leaving that church. Where do I go? And I'm like, okay, join this mainline church. So it's like, I'm not blaming them for the fact that Steve Lawson had moral failings. That can happen anywhere. But in a Presbyterian church, the pastors are interchangeable. Like some Presbyterian churches I've gone to, and it's like there's a different pastor preaching each week, and I don't even know the difference. I'm just like, because the theology of the church is not the theology of the pastor. It's the confessions. So it doesn't matter what the pastor personally believes. It's as long as he preaches according to the confessions. But in non-denominationalism, each pastor is the pope of his own church, and every non-denominational church is its own denomination. The biggest argument for non-denominationalism is Christian unity, which is a good thing. All Christians should be united, but non-denominationalism isn't the way to do that. It's actually infinitely denominational. Because if Christianity is like a mirror and the different denominations are like cracks in the mirror, non-denominationalism doesn't glue them back together. It just further divides the cracks into individual grains of sand. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. Okay, so we've picked on the non-denominational church. Now I agree. Say you've got me over the hump. I believe in institutionalizing the church in some form or fashion, and like you said, I believe you brought up the study about the 40,000 different denominations, and that is like very overly estimated. But say that I believe in the institution. So now that takes us what to seven main lines that each of them have kind of broken away into maybe one or two conservative and liberal sects. But I believe in institution. Mm-hmm. Now you have to fight for PCUSA. Now you have to fight with United Methodists. So I guess I'm kind of steelmanning you. Okay, I believe in institution, but now if I look on the institution side, it seems to be more corrupt and liberal than anything we might be seeing in the non-denominational world. I mean, my pastor's pretty conservative and teaches conservative values, and we don't have a woman as a pastor. And so it doesn't look like the institutional side is working super well either. I mean, it's your whole premise. So walk me through that. I believe in institutional, but you do have to defend yourself because the institution's not working super well either.
Yeah, true. I mean, most of the reason it got this bad is because the conservatives gave up on the institutions and left. So I will say three things. Number one, it's the fault of fundamentalists just as much as liberals. I'm not blaming non-denominationals this time. I'm just blaming Christian fundamentalism overall, which has always had a retreatist mindset. Number two, it's not like you can't be a traditional Christian in these denominations. It's just for the time being, you're going to have to share space with liberals. But it's a very modern presupposition to say that finding a pure congregation is more important than being part of an institution. Because back in the day, people would be loyal to institutions even when the institutions were corrupt. In the 900s, it was like your priest was illiterate, your bishop hired prostitutes, and the Pope would host pagan orgies in the Vatican. And they'd still be like, yeah, I'm a peasant and I know all this and I hate it, and I'd still die for my church. I'd still die defending my church in the Crusades. That was people's mindset back then because they were so non-individualistic. They were so focused on the bigger picture that they were able to recognize the corruption of their king or their bishop or their priest even and still be loyal to the institution. But in America, with this consumeristic mindset, they're like, if my needs aren't getting met right now, I'm going to split off. It's like, I need a good place to raise my kids. You know, fathers raise their kids. Kids, if a kid has a strong father, they're going to turn out all right. I think most kids would much rather see their father fight for what they believe in. It's like kids don't really listen. Like a 4-year-old is not going to listen to what the pastor's preaching. The 4-year-old is going to listen to the father. And if a kid sees a father fighting for what he believes in, that is way more inspirational than a kid going to a Sunday school which teaches them fundamentalism, which they're probably going to rebel against when they become a teenager. Let's be honest. I've seen that a lot. But it's like even that mindset of I need to go to a church where my needs are being met. That's kind of like what you said and makes it all about you. To paraphrase JFK, ask not what the church can do for you, but what you can do for the church. So yeah, I'll admit it. Like you might be way more comfortable in some conservative offshoot church than in one of the mainline churches. But Christianity is not about you. It's about the kingdom of God. All Christians are a soldier for God's kingdom. So it'll help God's kingdom if you stay present in a corrupt institution and try to purify it. And the third thing is that this mission is absolutely doable, and it always has been doable. The only reason it hasn't worked is because conservatives keep jumping ship. But these liberal churches in the mainline, they are dying out. So if we just inject like a cohort of a bunch of faithful men and women into these churches, then in 30 years, we're going to be the only ones left. Like, trust me, the Orthobros and the Catholics and the non-denominationals are quick to point out that, oh, the mainline's not even going to be here in 30 years. And I'm like, exactly. That's why it's so easy to retake. Let me just tell you an anecdote, because anecdotes work on people way more than statistics. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about your audience. So here's an anecdote. There's tons of mainline churches in the PCUSA that actually are solid. They preach great doctrine and they have reverent worship. They're just full of boomers. So young people don't want to go there because, like, well, I want my needs to be met, and I can't find a trad wife in a boomer church. I'm not gonna riz up Marge and Susan. So they just avoid these churches. But my wife and I started attending one of these boomer mainline churches, and we got the Sunday school classes, like the adult Sunday school classes, to go from 5 old ladies to 17 people, mostly young theology nerds. Like it took us like 1 month to revitalize a
Mm.
mainline church. It took us
Mm.
1 month to do
Yep.
it.
Yep.
And now this church is like a bastion of Reconquista, and my pastor supports Reconquista. So it's possible. It is very doable. So the 3 things. Number 1, it's the fundamentalist's fault. Number 2, it's not about you. Number 3, you can still function as a conservative, even if you have to share space with liberals. And number 4, retaking them is the easiest battle in human history.
Mm. And I think this has to do with probably one of the things I'm the most passionate about is young men. I think young men seem to have a passion and a more traditional masculine disagreeableness about them that I haven't seen in the older generations. And I think I really cannot figure out the people who are in pastoral ministry in all of these churches that are taking place across America right now, where they went wrong, but they have led us so astray. And I'm kind of just getting more and more frustrated with how these men make decisions and how this has all happened. But young men seem to have a different tone about them. And I think we need to project this kind of masculine, old traditional energy that it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to bring up scripture. It's okay to be disagreeable with your maybe pastors if they don't have a good answer for things. Right now, it seems like a lot of men just sit in the pews and they know that they're slowly dying inside, but they don't really say much. Like, I don't get it. Like, I don't get like, and then you get into side conversations with them and they will openly talk about the things that they are they disagree with to their core. But then when it comes to actually like saying something about it or doing something about it is the more thing I want to press. They just like stand in fear. And it's like, we need men to step back up. And like you said, as soon as you get in a position and as soon as you start to express those ideas, it's not hard to do. It really isn't. It just takes some effort, some passion, and some leadership, some actual leadership, and things can change on a dime. And so I think men is kind of where this conversation is happening. And it sounds like that's where, I mean, you're asking young men to go to seminaries and take on leadership roles. And I am much more encouraged by the young men who are coming up that this could actually happen. And it doesn't have to happen in the next 10 years. It doesn't have to happen with those who are in leadership right now. We don't necessarily have to convince them yet. But if they can see a ground up movement with young men that are like, no, we saw how this all goes. All these churches are dying out. All these liberal women who are taking over the pulpit is not working. We have a matriarchy taking over in the actual households. Like, we're just not going to do that anymore. And I think that there's something there.
Absolutely. And like, I've picked on non-denominationals, but a lot of a lot of old conservative men in mainline churches are also part of the problem. Like, they won't retreat from the mainline churches, but they just sit back and watch as liberal women take over, and they don't say anything. And they'll tell you, like, I can't believe Pastor Susan made the whole sermon about Black Lives Matter. But they're like, it's like, is this really the generation that fought in Vietnam? Like, no, can't possibly be.
No, it's the hippies that came out of California and they just happened to scatter all across the country. And we're just like, ugh.
So many times I get many testimonies, often from like older people saying like, oh yeah, I was in this church. My great grandfather built this church with his bare hands, but I went to this one church and the pastor preached about politics and preached something woke, and I just left and never went back. And I was like, you didn't even talk to the pastor? You didn't even talk to other people in the church? You didn't even try to get involved? You just gave up like that? It's like, okay, bro, America maybe deserves to get invaded by foreign powers if that is how weak our men are. So it's like, young men, every young man wants to crusade. Realistically, are we going to crusade to take back Constantinople or Jerusalem? No, we're not. That's not going to happen. Realistically, can we crusade to take back our heritage institutions? Yes. It is so easy and it is so doable. So I speak to every young man watching this. I hope there's a million of you guys. Um, if you want something to fight for, if you want to fight for your heritage, there is a real way to do that. It's called Operation Reconquista. And the young men are like, but what if I have a liberal pastor? Okay, young men fought in the trenches and were eating rats to survive. You can survive Pastor Susan for 3 months. I will say that generally Reconquista is about trying to revitalize the conservative mainline churches, because there are thousands of those. They're a minority, but a minority of a huge institution is still a lot of churches. But even if your pastor is liberal, you will live. You will live. The young men who built Western civilization endured a lot worse than you did.
Yeah.
They died of smallpox and got stabbed with rusty bayonets so that you could whine about your pastor preaching something you disagree with.
Yep. And one thing I'll probably caveat with this, and you'd probably definitely agree with me on this, but as young men, don't just come in with bold, audacious claims like you come in for 3 months and then you want to sit down with your pastor and tell them everything they're doing wrong. Man, read, listen to podcasts, get into scripture, understand church history. If you are compelled to go study, I think you said earlier that I didn't go to seminary. I actually did go to seminary, but but if you want to go to Bible college, if you want to actually take on someone who knows a lot and be mentored by them, actually come up with somewhat of a plan, a biblical scriptural plan of why you might be saying the things that you're saying, not just coming up out of nowhere and just like saying everything that's wrong and just throwing bombs on your whole congregation, because that has never went well. And so young men have that passion, have that kind of, I would say, conviction, like strong conviction to want to help the church, but also you are very, very knowledgeable. You're a very smart man. And I think that it just hits different when you actually understand the 360 view of what you're talking about, rather than just like, I'm 22 and I'm just going to bust down doors and take my pastor out to coffee and tell them that they're liberal. And I don't know if that'll work, but I want to keep that passion, but I'll also educate that passion instead of just maybe smoking marijuana on the weekends and playing video games, like
now,
read a book.
To be fair, I once did take my pastor out to coffee and tell him how liberal he was, but that doesn't mean you need to do that.
Yeah.
That was my trial. That was in my trial and error stage. That was when I was a bit young and restless. Now I am much more calm and sane. Trust me.
I also want to pick your brain about this one last thing. So there are 7 mainline churches.
Yeah.
What do we do about that? So what do we do about, so obviously you're Presbyterian, you can go more into your vision for the organization that you have started if you actually want to give some more details about that. But with the 7 denominations, do you see that as an okay thing, that there's somewhat unity and uniformity if the conservatives come back to any of those 7 denominations? Or do you see us maybe one day coming under a full Protestant banner and not even breaking up into 7 different ways? Or do you think that those are okay?
I think it's okay for now because they're in communion with each other. Like, I see so many Protestants fantasizing, like, imagine if we united all Protestants. Guess what? That already exists. It's called mainline Protestantism. So the mainline Protestant churches are a bunch of groups that were historically separate, but during the 20th century, they all sort of went into full communion with each other. The Episcopal Church is in communion with the ELCA, and the ELCA is in communion with everyone else. So there are these 7 churches. It is just like Eastern Orthodoxy. You know, the Russian and Greek Orthodox churches are different. They have different traditions, but they're in communion with each other. Orthodoxy is not like Catholicism, where you have just one pope this is the head honcho of everything. Orthodoxy is a group of like 17 autocephalous churches that are in communion. I mean, there's the true Orthodox that are in schism with because of minor calendar differences. We don't need to talk about that right now. In mainline Protestantism, you have 7 autocephalous churches that are in communion. And I think that's okay. Is like, do they all need to be unified under one specific authority? Or is it okay for them to be independent but also in communion? I think that's okay. If you want me to give me the simplest argument for why mainline Protestantism is superior Christianity, superior to evangelicalism and Catholicism and Orthodoxy, it makes God's kingdom the biggest. I think because Jesus prayed for unity, it is a moral obligation for Christians to be in visible communion with as many other Christians as possible. If you are in a mainline Protestant church, you're in communion with every other mainline Protestant around the world. And there's tons of them, by the way. If you're in a non-denominational church, you're in communion with maybe 300 other people, and as opposed to 300,000 or maybe even 300 million. No, it's actually more like 300 million. I correct myself.
Yeah, like 3 billion. Yeah. Well,
Not 3 billion. There's
Catholic,
like 1
not the
billion Catholics, but you have, if you're mainline, there's like 300 million mainline Protestants, I think, about the population of America.
And so, yeah, so awesome. What else do I want to ask you? There was a video that you made not too long ago talking about being an apologist for the Protestant church. I am curious to know why you stepped away from kind of maybe that perspective of yourself that the outside world might have had. And then also, do you feel like it is beneficial or helpful to fight against the Orthodox in the Catholic Church when it comes to apologetics, when it comes to making YouTube content? Or do you think a lot of people who maybe even halfway want to make content around Protestant Christianity to maybe just stick in our lane, to build up our base, to Reconquista, and not go so hard on trying to debate the Catholics and the Orthodox on every little thing? Because they're going to keep attacking.
It's a good question. So now there's a difference between like what I think I should do and what people should do in general. Like the reason I gave up apologetics was, you see, I'm not educated. I've never gone to seminary. And I kept debating, getting dragged into debates with people who have gone to seminary. Like Jay Dyer has been debating for like 20 years and went to seminary and studied philosophy for 20 years, and me, this random Minecraft YouTuber. And people were like, oh, I converted to Orthodoxy because of your debate with Jay Dyer. I was like, okay, dude, I've also lost debates with atheists. Would you have gone atheist if you had watched one of those debates? Like, are you that weak-willed? Do you have that little critical thinking that you'll convert based on one debate? Like, bro. But still, I kept getting my butt kicked in these debates simply because I've not gone to seminary. And I know that there's many other Protestants who have gone to seminary who could beat these guys in a debate, but they don't because they're lazy and they're retreatist. So I kept being in these conversations with these more educated Reformed people, these more educated Presbyterians, often in some retreatist group like the OPC or the PCA. And they kept being armchair quarterbacks for me. They're like, actually, you should have said like this and this and this, and you should have actually read this, and you should have done this. And I'm like, okay, why don't you do it? If you're that smart, why don't you do it? And they're like, well, actually, no, because you see, I'm kind of busy. Okay. And by the way, I don't think Catholics and Orthodox are damned. I don't think they're heretics. And these guys are like, well, you see, Orthodoxy and Catholicism is like heretical and people are being damned. Okay, if you really think that, if you really believe that, you would step into the apologetics wing. If you cared about saving souls from the evils of Catholicism and Orthodoxy, supposedly, you would do apologetics, but you don't. You're just an armchair quarterback. So my giving up was sort of just like trying to stick it to the conservative Protestants who kept nitpicking what I do, but not doing anything themselves. And I've told every single one of these guys, every single one, if you make a YouTube channel, I will promote it and I'll get you tons of subscribers. But none of them do it. One of them made like one YouTube video 6 months ago and thought that was enough. They don't do it. They're lazy. They're retreatist, just like a lot of conservative Protestants. So that was my personal reason. What about in general? What do I think Protestants should do in general? So I think there's a place for defense, but not offense, because don't repay evil for evil. I personally have no desire to convert cradle Catholics or cradle Orthodox people. They're an important part of the Christian family tree. I think ecumenical dialogue can help Protestants fix our problems and can help them fix their problems without us having to try and convert each other. And what I'm saying is exactly what Pope Francis said. Pope Francis said proselytism is a sin against ecumenism when he was talking to a bunch of Lutherans. So whenever a trad Catholic tries to convert me, I'm like, submit to your Pope. Your Pope told you not to do that. So do we need to make videos attacking Catholicism and Orthodoxy and saying why they're like bad? No. We should have apologists who can respond to the slander against Protestants, because most of it's just not true. We do need people who can respond to the intellectual challenges of Protestantism, like the canon conundrum. Like, how can you possibly know anything ever? How can you have any epistemic justification without the Eastern Orthodox Church? Like, we need people to respond to, logical traps like that. So we do need intellectual Protestant apologists to defend Protestantism. I'm not interested in attacking other Christians, especially other Christians that have this rich heritage, and there already is ecumenical dialogue. Like Catholicism and Orthodoxy has improved due to the ecumenical movement. I think we should just keep doing that rather than just trying to steal sheep from them. But we do need to try and give resources to young men who feel conflicted about Protestantism. And there's also a lot of ecclesial anxiety, because ecclesialism is the belief like of Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy and Oriental Orthodoxy that there's no salvation outside this one particular institution. And a lot of young men convert out of fear. Like, I don't want to go to hell, so I guess I have to be Eastern Orthodox. That is a pastoral need. If conservative Protestant denominations like the PCA really cared about pastoring people, like they claim we're all about faith alone. Okay, this is your chance to prove it. I know so many young men who actually have lost assurance of salvation because they're worried by the claims of these ecclesialist groups. So this is the PCA's chance to go into Avengers mode. They're a decently sized denomination. Surely they can pool funds together to fund just one trained seminary apologist. Right now, I'm in talks with a lot of the leadership of the denomination, trying to convince them to get going. I'm still waiting on that. So that's why I've realized help will not come from the PCA. Help will not come from any of the schismatic offshoots. Help will not come from the evangelicals. If we are going to revitalize Protestantism, it's only going to come from the mainlines.
Yeah. I actually want to ask you about that. How does your denomination take all your videos and your Reconquista? Have you ever gotten just a random email about, hey, tone it down?
So no, I've never gotten them talk to me directly. And I have allies in the denomination, but there's a lot of pastors in the denomination who talk amongst each other on Facebook groups. And these are not the faithful ones. These are the liberal ones who don't believe in Jesus. And they call me a lot of colorful language that you wouldn't think a pastor would use. And behind closed doors, I've heard them admit some pretty incriminating things, that not literally, but they say like, oh, these young men are trying to take back our church. Don't they realize we'd rather run our denomination into the ground than have it stand for anything other than justice? So like they are suicidal about the denomination. So there are a lot of people in the denomination who don't like me, but I see in their Facebook groups, they're like, we need to take this threat seriously because these young men are actually seeing some success. So, well, that's just encouragement to me.
Yeah. I always wondered that because you're sticking with it. I think I saw a video with Matthew Everhard that said he would recommend you give up. And so I was like, man, there's even guys within the same faith or same denomination
Matthew Everhard, he's great as a pastor, and his book Worship Tainment is great. He's not in the PCUSA. He's in the
PCA, right?
He's in one of the schismatic groups. So obviously those people are going to say, oh yeah, you should join us in the schism. So like that's just sort of their own bias. I will say that every conservative pastor in the PCUSA has been cheering on the Reconquista movement. My pastor was so thrilled when he heard about it.
Nice. Yeah. I want to finish the circle on the Catholic stuff. You talked about the one true church. I think that it's almost as if a memo goes out truly with talking points, and the Catholic apologists, they have such a good way of, I would say, yeah, like you said, almost fear mongering about the one true church. And the thing that really discourages me is that we are so much more charitable towards their perspectives, and we're so much more charitable towards everyone who claims Christ as Lord and truly has faith only in him. No matter what denomination, they are going to be saved. And this one true church language, man, it's hard because they're basically saying, if you don't have our Eucharist, if you don't have our baptism, if the sacraments are not under our apostolic succession, then you're not truly a Christian. And man, what a powerful statement to those who are not educated. And I get where people get confused. And I don't know how to graciously approach, like you said, the defense of the Protestantism and trying to help people understand multiple different perspectives, while also not veering into the attack world of apologetics, because they are definitely not giving us any charity. They are so aggressive in their speech, and they're all saying one thing. That's the hard part, is all of these guys, no matter what channel you watch, it's genuinely like they have a memo of their talking points, and it's the same thing over and over.
Yeah.
And that is like a full out attack on young men who do not understand
Yes.
where Protestantism truly stays. And I don't know how to approach the making of the content, because I don't have really any desire to make specific Catholic, like, hey, this is why we broke away, or like, this is why they're wrong.
And
This,
then,
like,
we did not break away. If you admit we
got
broke
kicked out.
away,
Yes, that's
yeah.
true. That's
If
true. We got
my
kicked
boss
out.
if my boss throws me out of the window at work, he can't get mad at me for quitting my job.
Okay.
And there were
I
actually some Protestants during the Reformation who did throw Catholics out the window, who defenestrated them. That was a funny story. But anyway.
We got kicked out, and Martin wanted nothing to do with actually creating his own thing.
And he tried
wanted
to unite with
reform.
Eastern Orthodox. He got kicked out of the Catholics, and he called up the Eastern Orthodox on the phone. He was like, all right, can we unite with you guys now? And they're like, do you accept kissing icons for salvation? And he was like, well, no. They're like, then don't talk to us. That's literally how the phone call went.
the letter, yeah. And I'm just kind of troubled with that, because it seems like they're gaining so much momentum with the digital presence, with the propaganda you talked about at the beginning, and then Protestants with our heart, we don't have near as much bold language, and so I'm confused on what to do with all that.
Yeah, well, the thing is, they say like, oh, we're the one true church, and you say that's a bold claim, it can be offensive. That doesn't mean it's wrong. So like a lot of times they'll say, oh yeah, Protestants are just giving emotional arguments, and that's a fair critique. It's like saying Christianity is the one true religion. That's offensive, but we believe it. I'm not going to become some universalist who thinks that Muslims can be saved just because it's less offensive to say so. So I think the question shouldn't be like, oh, you are attacking us by saying that. Is it true, or is it not true?
Amen.
I mean, is it true?
No.
Yeah. So then we have to explain why it's not true. Mm-hmm. What I would say is this concept of the one true church is the fruit of the threats of dead Byzantine emperors who wanted to unify their empire. There was the concept of this one true united church as an institution outside of which there was no salvation. That concept comes from the ecumenical councils. The ecumenical councils come from Constantine. Now, I'm not one of those guys who's like, Constantine's bad. Yeah, it was good that the Council of Nicaea helped stamp out Arianism. But you can read the ecumenical councils one by one, and they gradually degenerate from, helpful clarifications on theological issues to anathemas over silly things. And by the time you get to the seventh one, the one that says you need to kiss paintings or burn in hell, by the time you get to that one, they actually invent the anathema service, where once a year, Eastern Orthodox people will sing about how all other Christians are going to hell. So that it's important to study this stuff, and not just be drawn in by the smells and bells, and to think critically and not believe every argument you see online. Like a lot of these Gen Alpha guys who are converting, they failed English class because they went to Zoom public school and their teachers were incompetent. But there's something called bias and critical thinking. When someone makes a claim, you have to evaluate their bias, and you have to see, is what they're claiming actually accurate? Is what the narrative they're spewing actually how it went down?
Amen. Redeemed Zoomer, it was an absolute pleasure. We've been trying to get this for a little bit now, and I'm just so glad that it came together. I respect you tremendously. I love your channel. Keep doing the good work. I know you're not an apologist now, but I think you're just such a good voice for the Protestant side, even though you wouldn't consider me Protestant. But truly, I respect you tremendously. I hope the Lord just continues to grow your movement and your channel, and that you just become a beacon of hope. And I'd say common sense. I think you used common sense somewhere in this podcast. Common sense it seems like it's making a comeback here in America, which is a nice feeling. And so
it's not just a term; it's an actual whole philosophy. The philosophy developed by Scottish Presbyterians in response to the Enlightenment was Scottish common sense realism, and it was the philosophy of Princeton Seminary for hundreds of years, thanks to John Witherspoon. Fun fact: Protestants have a very fun heritage, and if you're mainline, you know things like that.
It's like you're full of Snapple facts. Do you have like a photogenic memory? Like how do you retain all this, out of curiosity?
I don't. I forget a lot of things. I forget what my homework is most days. No, I don't know. I just sort of like read things and listen to things, and I I hyper fixate on what I'm really passionate about, which is fixing the main lines. So anything that's relevant to that, I think about. Things that are not relevant to that, I don't know anything about. Like I I don't know what anything about like what Taylor Swift or Beyonce recently did. Like I don't know. I don't know any of that.
I get that. And I feel like as I get older, I just dial into more and more things that I truly do care about and just shoving everything else just completely out of my mind anymore. But
Yeah.
as I'm finishing up this podcast, I want you to talk about both your organization. And so like, what is the URL, or how can people sign up, or if they're convicted about that. And then also your map. I thought that was an extremely helpful resource for people. Talk about those two things before we get off here.
Well, thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. So, the movement I started is Operation Reconquista, and you can find out about it operationreconquista.com. Just look it up, and it's a decentralized movement of organizations specifically dedicated to retaking each church. So, Reconquista is not an official organization, but there's official organizations within it. So, mine is Presbyterians for the Kingdom, which is an official nonprofit dedicated to retaking the PCUSA, and we actually have an official collaboration with conservative PCUSA seminary professors. So we have real standing in the denomination. It's a nonprofit we started last year, but we've already made a lot of change in the denomination. So there's that. So Operation Reconquista has a map of moderate to conservative mainline churches all throughout America. So unless you're in the middle of nowhere, Alabama, you can probably find a decent mainline church in America near you. Now, what if you're not necessarily looking for a mainline church? What if you're just looking for any sort of historic Protestant church and you're not in America? Well, I have a personal map of historic churches all over the world, including in like Kazakhstan and Indonesia. And that map includes basically any traditional style Protestant church. Even if it's in one of the retreatist denominations, I'll still include that, because there are some churches that are like Protestant churches that are very traditional that are not in communion with the mainline. Like there are some solid PCA churches. So my personal map includes those. The Reconquista map only includes mainline churches. But so if you're in America, like I'd recommend the mainline map. If you're in like Indonesia or something, I have like there are historic, beautiful Protestant churches all around the world, including like Cameroon and Kazakhstan and Malaysia. It's everywhere. Protestants are everywhere because we did a lot of mission work over the centuries because we didn't think the kingdom of God was mostly confined to Eastern Europe. I'm not naming names, but we all know who I'm talking about. So that's where you can find me. And yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.